Okay, hopefully people can see and hear me. It's the first time I'm using something like this. Hopefully it is all working properly. So welcome. Thank you for spending 1.5 term days with me, looking at what every teacher needs to know about reading and comprehension. Hopefully this whole process will take about an hour of me kind of talking at you. I hear there is a chat function. I think I can see that up there, so I'll get to your questions as well, but there will be time for questions at the end, most importantly. So let's get going. Big part of the reason why I wanted to do this was because of a tweet by John Hutchison a couple of days ago about the understanding of phonics. Phonics is a key element of early reading. And so I think, and I hope that we have some secondary colleagues with us today. Certainly when I've done a similar talk in the past at Research Ed Surrey, we had plenty of secondary colleagues there, and I think they all took something quite meaningful away from it. So I want people to know that this is kind of something for everyone, whether you teach in primary or secondary. What I want from this is that people can go back to their schools and they can improve the opportunities and the chances for children being able to read successfully. This is offers a very brief kind of rundown of what this little talk will look like. I've added a few extra bits in because sometimes I just can't help myself. But here's the main outline for this session. Before we get that though, I think we need to really understand and unpick the word reading, because if you say the word reading to various people, all hell can break loose. So reading is very much two elements. There's that translation of print to sound, which is decoding and word recognition. And then there's that making meaning from that translation, and we call that comprehension. One way that some arguments begin to happen is that when certain individuals will say reading, they may just be referring to the reading and the word recognition, whereas other people are implying and inferring both of these kind of processes. So to kind of make everything a little bit simple, if I talk about reading, I'm talking about both of these processes together combined. And then if I want to talk about just that decoding or that word recognition element, I will just refer to it as decoding word recognition as best as I possibly can. So reading in numbers, where is it all going wrong? Quite a lot of research over the last 10 odd years or so detailing really how approximately 20 to 25% of children are leaving school illiterate. So here, a DFE report in 2015, 1 in 5 children in England cannot read well by the age of 11. Again, research conducted by the OECD, 18% of pupils in England at 15 years old do not have the minimum level of literacy proficiency. By final year of compulsory schooling in England, the reading skills of children from disadvantaged backgrounds are on average almost 3 years behind those from affluent homes. 1 in 11 children and young people in the UK miss the benefit of having their own books, something that I find particularly shocking. But then when we look at how that translates to disadvantaged pupils, it goes to 1 in 8 pupils who receive a free school meal. And some of the more recent literature that I can find on this kind of subject comes from the Read All About It report, and that was only a year ago, obviously prior to that pandemic, where 25% of 15-year-olds have a reading age under 12. So I think it's kind of clear from here that there is work to be done. not just in each individual sector of primary and secondary, but thinking together as a whole, how we can come together to stop failing that kind of bottom 20, 25%. Reading in numbers now with the English language. Historically, there have kind of been three approaches to learn to decode words, so that translating of print and turning it into sound. That's either through phonics, which we will look at into more depth, whole words, where children would be expected to memorize and learn whole words as a whole unit, and later on I'll outline why my interpretation of the evidence, why that isn't such a great way to children to learn to read. And then you have this idea of balanced literacy, which, funny enough, tries to balance those two further approaches. However, it's quite a loaded term. No one really knows how balanced literacy should be, or whether it has benefits over a mainly whole phonics approach, just in terms of its teaching children to decode. Quite simple bits and pieces. There are 26 letters in the alphabet, 44 sounds in the English language. So every word that you can think of that we use in English, it's only around 44 sounds, varies depending on where you are in the world and your accent. Of those 44 sounds, it's roughly made up of 25 consonant sounds and 19 vowel sounds. There are 76 consonant blends. Now, consonant blend is just where you would have two or more consonants, and then you attempt to blend those together. So, for example, in the word like creek, the first two consonant letters are C and R, and so that the sound that you get from the k and the make that blend. For students to be able to understand what they're reading, for that comprehension to happen, it's approximately 90 to 95% of the words need to be known from that particular text for the reader to have a good chance of understanding what they are reading. This one that always kind of surprises some people. Of those 44 sounds, there are 176 common spellings. So part of the difficulty of the English language is to manipulate and use those 26 letters of the alphabet to spell those sounds, and there are 176 common ways with which we can spell those sounds with. When we come to want to read aloud, the average reader has words accurate correct per minute of around 250 to 300, but that's a reading silently. It's slightly slower if we ask students, and if we ask ourselves even, to read aloud. 2.5 to 500,000. This is an important number. It refers to the number of logographical images that can be held in long-term memory. A logographical image just refers to any image that can represent a word itself. A good example is the pound sign, for example. That image or that logo of the pound sign, we know represents and stands for the word pound. Now, it's anticipated that the limits of human memory that we can hold these logographical images is between 2.5 to 5,000. 2.5, relatively quite simple. We can push it up to about 5,000 with a lot more extraneous efforts. There are 55,000 legal English syllables, and this will be very important when we have a brief kind of detour of the history of the writing system. About 70,000 words makes up the average vocabulary for the first language English speaker. And so now I think we'll look at some models of reading that I think are really important for children to be, for adults, teachers to be aware of. This is the simple view formula presented by Goff and Tumler in 1986, and there's various adaptations and updates to it throughout the years, but this is the kind of the classic one, where they kind of stipulate what's necessary for children to be able to read fluently. So there's kind of two cognitive practices that need to happen here. This is our word recognition, so our actual decoding, and that can be seen through our horizontal axis here. And then you have what we call our language comprehension, which can be seen on the vertical here. Very important that we notice that they're talking about language comprehension here. There is, high correlation between a student's language comprehension, so can they actually understand words that are being said to them, and their actual reading comprehension. Now, what's really important about this particular model is that it is multiplicative and not additive. So I need to be able to have, if I have weak decoding or word recognition and very poor language comprehension, I end up in this area here. Now, this is useful in terms of diagnostics because it tells me, first of all, I need support with my word recognition processes. So I'm going to need something that's going to help me translate the code from print to sound. But also there's something else going on there with my language comprehension process as well. Even if someone is reading something to me or they're asking me to do something, I'm struggling to understand what's happening there. Because this is multiplicative, say 0 and 0 times 0 is still going to equal 0. So my reading comprehension is still going to be non-existent. Say though, however, that I have poor word recognition processes, so this is worth 0, but my language comprehension process is pretty good because it's multiplicative. My reading comprehension is still going to be pretty much 0. There's nothing that I can do between the language comprehension that will help necessarily improve my word recognition process. There are two separate entities that work together, but there's nothing I can't improve one to help necessarily improve the other. They have to work separately. And so then the same would go for if I had very good decoding skills, so I was very apt at translating the code and the print in front of me into phonemes, into sounds. I could put them all together pretty fluently. That's great. However, if my language comprehension is failing me, then my reading comprehension is still going to be 0. What we want and what we're aiming for and what we want all our children to kind of leave with, and this is kind of where that kind of 75% who aren't kind of failing right now will be, is where we have high word recognition processes and high language comprehension processes. This is the sweet spot. Anything else, that kind of tells us that some intervention is going to have to happen to make sure these children can move up to this kind of upper right quadrant. Another particular model that I really think every teacher should be aware of is this reading rope, so Scarborough's reading rope. It was a way to represent how the related cognitive processes work together so that an individual can become a skilled reader. So it kind of looks at that language comprehension, that word recognition in a bit more detail than just Goff and Tumner's simple view of reading. So when we think about language comprehension, the things that we mean are things like background knowledge, the facts and concepts that we bring, that we know about the wider world, the vocabulary, our understanding of language structures, the verbal reasoning that we can do, as well as literacy knowledge. So the idea of we know how a fairy tale works, for example. We know how a story involving heroes and villains might end out that the hero will more than likely be victorious at the end. And then there are things that are in our word recognition, like our phonological awareness, so that's our understanding and our ability to hear specific sounds. There's that decoding, which we talked about, which is that understanding of what those sound spelling correspondences are that are on the paper. And then obviously we have that sight recognition, which is where we become so adept and so proficient at this decoding that we can read these words increasingly quickly. And what this model tries to encapsulate is that each of these threads start quite separately, but they gradually intertwine and they become eventually a full rope. While I do very much like this model, I think it's not without its criticisms. I think, for example, one criticism of the model is that each individual weave is exactly the same in length and thickness, where actually the amount of effort that is needed to really kind of decode comes, far more effort needs to be in the decoding element, perhaps than just the phonological awareness. So when we're talking about language comprehension, this background knowledge aspect, should be, I think, a far more wider piece of twine than it is represented there it is not a good model for us to think about, well, I need equal amounts of each of these to make sure that children turn into these skilled readers. We have to know very precisely which of these are the good bets that we should focus our attention on, which is obviously predominantly all of word recognition, because if children can't decode the letters in front of them, they will struggle to, there's no chance of them reading. Things like background knowledge, vocabulary are kind of high tier elements we really want children to know about. A little bit of language structure, a little bit of verbal reasoning, a little bit of literacy knowledge isn't going to do any harm. But without vocabulary, without high background knowledge, children are more likely to struggle. And more recently, actually just kind of released just today, actually, is this particular model where Hoover and Tumner from the simple view of reading, bring out this new model which looks at the cognitive capacities needed to master the simple view of readings to proximal causes, the proximal causes being language comprehension and word recognition. What's nice about this particular model is that you kind of need to read it from the bottom up. So to start off with, for the word recognition, students need to have good phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is our understanding of being able to hear particular phonemes within words. So if I say the word sat, you need to be able to hear the sounds s, at. This then goes with our letter knowledge, not necessarily knowledge of the letter names, but understanding the sounds, but also which symbol represents which sound. And then equally, there are concepts about print. So understanding that in English, for example, a gap represents a space between words. You need to understand that we read text left to right. We read it at the top and then go down. So those ideas about print that students need to know. Then there's knowledge of the alphabetic principles. That's understanding that there can be a one-to-one correspondence, or there can be a one-to-many correspondence between the letters, between the sounds and the letters that we use to spell those sounds. The alphabetic coding skills, so students' use of actually being able to do this together. That will then get us to word recognition. Likewise, with language comprehension, we need to have this phonological knowledge, so this idea of being able to hear sound. Syntactic and semantic, again, coming from the aspects from the reading rope. A lovely one here for kind of background knowledge and inferencing skills. I'm not too keen that they've used the word skill there, but it's nice that inferencing has been used within background knowledge. And then plenty of linguistic knowledge as well of how they can use what they know about other stories, about other authors, the genre, to kind of combine that to create language comprehension. And then you have this wonderful end goal of reading comprehension. In terms of how reading scientists assume that reading works in the mind, one of the popular computational models is this kind of triangle framework. And it's adapted from Seidenberg and McClelland. If you haven't read Language at the Speed of Sound, I highly recommend that you read that book from Seidenberg. It goes into a lot of detail of how this works. But effectively, we might take something like phonology, so the sounds that we hear, and then there is this kind of reciprocal processing that happens. When we are a novice reader, we might rely on these sounds to begin with, and these sounds may activate some meaning, but at the same time, when we're learning to read k, a, t, we link those sounds to the particular spellings, so the symbol for C, for k, the symbol for a, the symbol for t. And then we eventually understand that spelling of C-A-T represents the phonemes k, a, t, which at the same time activates meaning. So we understand that this three-letter word, actually this three-letter word stands for something that has 4 legs, a tail, can be quite small, quite furry, etc., etc. And then linked onto that, sometimes we might then need to go and think about the wider context to help us understand the actual meaning itself. Now, what's important to note is that when we start learning to read, we are heavily, heavily reliant on this particular channel here, our phonological channel, to really, really translate the sounds into print, because we do not have as novice readers, they wouldn't have the necessary spelling to sound correspondence needed to see a word and necessarily recognize it straight away. As we get more experts, we actually can look at the spelling. But again, this is a reciprocal nature, so we don't necessarily just then forget the phonological channel whatsoever. As I say, you can see from the arrows, they work both ways. It's just that it means that we get there, we can get there quicker as an expert reader when we get to the spelling. What we can't do, though, and it's impossible to do, in my opinion, is leave out this phonological channel. So, I want to take you through very quickly through a brief history of writing systems, because if you want to understand how to read, I think it's really important that we understand how it is that we're fortunate enough in the year 2021 AD that we actually are able to write. So about 30,000 years ago, approximately, that's when man started to paint pictures on caves, and they were very typical representations of what they could see. So they're what we call a pictograph. So here you can see hunters hunting kind of some deer, and so that's kind of very clear as to what this picture represents. But it really was something of a cultural revolution at that time, this idea that through drawing certain representations, man could start recording the things that they had seen. Now that's quite useful, but it's also quite primitive. This would be great for common and proper nouns, for example, but there might be a bit of meaning that would get lost in translation. If we just had 3 deer, that might mean there are plenty of deer here. It might mean these deer are particularly aggressive, don't try and hunt them. But also then we have a problem with more abstract terminology. It's very hard for something like love or an abstract noun like idea to be formed. So after a couple of hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of years rather, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, they had a pretty nifty idea, and it's called, it comes from the rebus principle, this idea that actually we could match certain pictures together to create what they call logographs. Now, a logograph, as mentioned earlier, is just where you have certain symbols that represent something. So here I have an eye and I have a deer. So they might use those 2 symbols to represent the word idea. However, that gets very confusing very quickly, because actually I might want this to represent that I've seen a deer or something like that. I don't want it to represent this kind of abstract noun of idea. So a couple of thousands of years in the past, we have this idea then of phonology. We actually understand, smarter people than I started to think about, well, the smallest unit of sound that we can think about. Now, for some languages, particularly Japanese, kana, that smallest unit of sound that they need to make sense is the syllable. So Japanese, Chinese, still particularly syllabic languages, because they only have roughly 100 legal syllables. So they could match 1 symbol for certain syllables. And if we remember that we can hold about 2,500 logographs in our long-term memory, that fits easily within the limits. Interestingly, for Japanese, for kanji, they actually still use some elements of logographs as well, but still only around 100-ish, so still far within those limits of what we can hold in our long-term memory. And so as our vocabularies expanded, this was then the problem, where they needed to find a way to write and represent the sounds that they were hearing. Pictograms and logographs wouldn't necessarily do the trick, because there's just at this stage, potentially too many words for them to actually make anything meaningful from. And then the Phoenicians came around and they had something called an alphabet, which was just a symbol that represented not a syllable, but a phoneme, the smallest, purest sound in our case, the English language. Now, through history, Greeks, the Romans, they liked this idea. There was lots of swapping around, and eventually we kind of ended up with the alphabet system that we use right now in England. But this is not to say that an alphabet is somehow superior to a syllabic language. It's merely the most efficient way for us to represent the language that we have. Because we have around 55,000 legal syllables, we would need about 55,000 logos to represent those syllables. If our long-term memory constraint is around 2,500, 5,000, that's not going to work. Alphabet, though, well, that only has 26 letters, so we can remember 26. There are only 44 sounds in the English language. That's definitely kind of within the limits of our long-term memory. And 176 common spellings, far more likely to be remembered than trying to remember 55,000 different symbols for a syllable. Far easier than trying to remember 70,000 images for particular words, as well as then you have that issue of, well, how do we actually then represent these abstract nouns or any abstract language? I wish that was the end, but it's not. We then have this particular case of orthography. So ortho, just something regular, true or correct, and graphy is to do with writing and recording. Different languages, for a host of different reasons, have different orthographies. So if you have a shallow language, you have a near one-to-one correspondence between the symbol that you choose to represent that sound and the sound itself. A deep orthography has a one-to-many correspondence, which means that one particular spelling could represent many sounds, or indeed one sound could be represented by many different spellings. And so you have things like this, tends to say very basic, but Finnish has a near one-to-one correspondence, which is why they can learn to decode very quickly. If I have any Welsh people in the audience, I could teach you the Welsh alphabet very quickly, and you could decode some Welsh very quickly because it is near one-to-one as well. Some of the languages, they then get a bit more complicated, and then you kind of have English, which is one of, if not the most complicated language when it comes to its orthography, how we actually learn to spell. And so here's why the orthography in English is particularly difficult. One letter can spell one sound. So this little symbol here makes the A sound, as in had. Two letters can spell one sound. So in this case, sh, or the S and the H, makes the sh in, or spells the sh in shelf. Three letters can spell one sound. So this IGH spelling can spell the I sound, as in night. You can go up to four letters being one sound. This idea of this spelling, EIGH, being the A sound, as in 8. Doesn't stop there, though. We have one spelling and different sounds. So this EA spelling can be E, as in beak, but it can also be A, as in steak. And then you have one sound, different spelling. So the spelling of the sound E, for example, has about 7 or 8 different common spellings. So we can spell the E sound with one E, two E's. We can have what we call a split E, or we can have the EA as well. And let's say other languages, some European, some not, don't necessarily have this particular problem. We can kind of see that from here from Seymour, Aro, and Erskine. This was the errors in word reading at the end of first grade, so about year 2. So here in England, there were 67 errors. Compare that to something like Finnish, where their orthography is far shallower. They're only getting 2%, 6%, 8%. Okay, yeah, there are some languages that still have, quite a deeper orthography than Finnish and our Scandinavian friends, but not quite as deep as ours. There's Portugal, about 23% of errors, French, 28% of errors. Italy's doing absolutely fine. And so this is one of the reasons why it's really important that, in my view, that children learn to read at a very young age, at around 4, because if they do not, because of the way that our language is represented and because of this deep orthography, it will take them longer to understand all of these ideas. And these are all ideas, by the way, if you can read this, and if you are a fluent reader, you have subconsciously kind of understood these ideas, but it may be the first time that you're seeing it kind of written down, and that's probably where, hopefully, a light bulb moment is heading off. So I want to kind of talk about how learning to read or becoming an expert reader is a little bit like becoming an expert biker. So where do we start off? Well, we start off with phonics. The reason we start off with phonics is because there are only kind of hundreds. There are 44 sounds in the English language. These can be represented by these 26 letters, depending on how we choose to manipulate them. Our phonics, they're the small, or our phonemes are the smallest unit of sound in our particular language. For us to be able to use and kind of break in our phonics before we become an expert biker, we need to be able to see and get on a bike. And so I think this is the phonemic awareness. And this is one of the first hurdles where students can fall flat already. If you can't locate and you can't hear those different sounds in words, then there is a problem already. If you can't hear and you can't distinguish between those different sounds, then learning those sounds is going to be particularly difficult. So one way that we do this is we might, in nursery, in reception, we might make 3 sounds, clap our hands 3 times, see if children respond to that. We might use different sounds, bells, chimes, whatever it may be, so they become aware, more aware of what we call phonological awareness, which is understanding sounds in general, before kind of homing down and doing our reading with them to see if they can develop phonemic awareness, which is where you get the mums and dads going mum, for example. All of that incidental stuff is building up that phonemic awareness that there is this sound or d, dad, for example, whatever it may be. And these are things that parents generally do, but it can be an issue, particularly when we're talking about reception, year 1, glue ear, for example. If students have glue ear at such a young age, that's going to prevent their phonemic awareness from developing as well as it could do. Assuming that children do have this phonemic awareness, and it's not necessarily a clear transition between, we need to make sure there's this basic level of phonemic awareness and then they're ready for phonics. These 2 things are reciprocal. Phonemic awareness can develop as students learn phonics. So you may spend a bit of phonemic awareness time in nursery, but when they get to reception, we can develop this phonemic awareness as we teach them phonics. Now, as you've seen, there's lots and lots of problems with our English language. 1 spelling, 1 sound, 1 symbol for 1 sound, 2 symbols for 1 sound, etc., etc. So what we do first is that we teach them a basic code. So we effectively tell children that each letter in the alphabet only really has 1 sound, and this makes it far easier for them. This is where the role of decodables comes in, so that they can read just these words that map to this one-to-one correspondence. Okay, it's this idea of this false alphabet that we give kind of students. And it's important because if we know about cognitive load theory, if we just threw all of this at one stage at the same time, it would cause confusion. Once students have mastered the basic code, and they mastered the basic code at some point in year 1 on average, or then maybe we'll give them some stabilizers, we'll teach them a more advanced code, and that's where we can start teaching them that there is more than 1 sound that can be matched to these symbols, or we can use these symbols in such a way that we can use 2 of them to represent 1 sound. And so I think here, this is a nice representation of just those nice balance bikes, When we get into the advanced code, yeah, okay, we're going to put some stabilizers on that bike to help you get along with it. And so what this might look like for those of you that are particularly interested in phonics and kind of developing this kind of phonemic awareness is that there are some underlying skills needed for students to be able to do it. So they need to be able to segment and blend. Now, those are the skills that are needed, and that's what tends to happen would be is, right, I need someone to come up to the board and spell the word sat. And we'd say the word very slowly. We might segment it. So segment it is to just put it into its individual sounds. So sat. And then you might ask the children, which symbol represents the s, which one represents the a, which one represents the t, for example. And so children may eventually bring down those. And we can say, well done. We'd get the children to say the sounds in isolation. So s, a, t, and then we get them to blend it all together by pushing those sounds together by saying sat. And that's lovely. That's what kind of most phonics programs at a minimum will kind of do. But there is something else I think that we can be doing with our students as well. And that's this idea of where the skill of segmenting, so breaking something down into its component sounds and blending it together versus the task, we can be a tiny bit more clever in what we get students to do next. So instead, if I wanted the word pat, instead of me putting all of those tiles back like this, I might just ask the students, well, how do I change the word sat to pat? And by asking this, what we're actually doing is engaging far more phonemic skills than just pure segmenting and blending. Because if I'm asking you to change the word sat to pat, then what you are doing is that you are breaking sat into its component pieces. You're isolating the s part of sat. You're then telling yourself, well, if I want pat, s needs to go. So I'm going to change it to p, and then I'll bring it down here. So instead, we can just change that. So what we're doing there by changing that is that we are really building that phonemic awareness at that same time. So we're getting children to analyze the word, break it down, isolate particular phonemes, delete and replace when necessary. Now, people who are familiar with phonics will know that the easier sounds to kind of isolate are the ones at the beginning and the end. So now I might say, right, we want to change pat to pan. So again, same process, segment pat to p. Isolate the t because I want to change it to pan. Okay, I need to change it to n. I need to know that this symbol here represents n. And so then we'll change it like that. Then to add additional challenge to make it harder for them, because I want them to be expert at isolating every part of the word, I might then ask them to change pan to pin. So again, same process, separate the segment pan into its component parts, p, a, n. Isolate the one that needs to change. In this case, it's the a. Identify what it needs to change to. It needs to go to the sound I. I then need to know which one of these represents the sound I, and then make that swap. Finally, of course, we might just ask them to do a complete deletion. So can we change the word pin to just the word in? So again, they'll segment and go p, I, n. They'll know that in I, there is no p at the beginning, and nothing needs to change. And so what we do by that is that we build up this phonemic awareness, and we're also teaching students that these funky little symbols here represent sound. And as we go through the phonics process, eventually we will have things like E-I-G-H on one card to represent the A sound. And we will build up over time all the sound spelling correspondences, these 176 common spellings for these particular sounds that we have. And so that is effectively what phonics is. Everyone who can read has mastered phonics. You are able to turn these particular symbols into the sounds that they stand for. You may not have had explicit phonics teaching, but I can guarantee you that someone would have said, you know, this here, this is it, or in this word, this symbol actually is the A sound. You might have had, you know, all that kind of stuff happening, and that's fine. It's still teaching phonics. It's still part of the process. And so again, this just kind of comes back rearranged, fully kind of go back on that message. We can't skip out this phonological part here. Doing all of these kinds of things is crucial, because eventually we will be able to map this spelling to that phonology, activate that meaning. So why learn phonics and not words by sight? Well, I kind of hope that I've gone some way in answering that question. If we learn words by sight and we look at the word as a whole unit, if we're happy to believe and accept that we have this kind of logographical upper limit of around 2,500-5,000 words, then it's just you are effectively limiting the child's vocabulary to that amount of words. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to have, you know, that pressure of deciding, well, this child seems to be failing phonics, so I'm just going to choose 2,500 to 5,000 words that they're going to be able to read, and that will be it. It's far easier to, and it will take a while, because obviously learning rates are all different, but it's far easier to teach students how to manipulate these 26 symbols, how they can be arranged to create 176 common spellings. That's far easier than learning 2,500 words as one particular part, or as one whole image. And again, we cannot bypass this phonological element here. It will not work. And we know this, we've known this for quite some time. Many studies have kind of shown how the brain sees images, to how the brain manipulates and uses sounds, for example. But one of the kind of, I think, the easiest experiment, and you can play along with this one, is this kind of Alden experiment from the 80s. And effectively, this is how the experiment worked. You've got plenty of children around, he'd show them a category. There'd then be a target word, and all the students had to do was just say whether the word belonged to that category by saying yes or no. So we can kind of play along with this right now. So the category is body part. The target is thigh. So is that target word part of the category? Yes, absolutely it is. The category is tool. Target word hammer. Yep. Category is vehicle. The target word is truck. Yeah, the target word belongs to the category. The category is animal. There's the target word. Now, if I was to hazard a guess, and if there was a buzzer that would measure reaction time, I would hazard a guess that there would be a slower reaction time for this particular target word compared to the others. Why? Well, because it's a homophone. So the word bear can belong in the category of an animal. But we know, because of the spelling of this particular word, it doesn't necessarily mean the bear as in that particular animal. So what's happening here is that we are seeing the word bear, we see in that spelling. We're mapping that spelling to the phonology. We're using then meaning, and then we're using the context as well of animal to know that it is not that the word bear here doesn't belong to this category. Now, if we could read by sight, and what I mean by that is that if we could look at the word bear as just one whole chunk, then our reaction time would be exactly the same. because we wouldn't have to then go through the meaning, we wouldn't have to go through the context, it wouldn't be needed, because we'd be able to just see that word as a whole and know straight away, yes, all of these, they do belong, no, they don't belong. But because of this really subtle, slower reaction time, we know that there is some additional phonological processing happening even at this point. And it even goes to things as well, like if we learn words as one particular as whole, then that means we'd also have to learn those words for every different font, because those fonts could look very different as well. So again, phonology, phonemes really are the bedrock and the groundwork for getting children to learn to read. But as I say, we're still at this point now where a parent, our training wheels may come off. We've got enough sound spelling correspondences in our bank. We can take those stabilizers off, but we still need someone just ready to kind of give us that final push. And this is where this concept of fluency comes in. And it's an often over-missed element of reading instruction. Fluency refers to, as you can see on the screen there, this idea of accuracy. So how accurate is my decoding? Am I translating that print from the page into sound? The automaticity, how much cognitive resources am I spending actually trying to translate that? And then the prosody, does it sound like natural language, or does it still sound quite robotic and quite stuttered? And fluency is this, what they call this bridge between word recognition and comprehension. If we do not read fluent enough, despite knowing our 176 common spelling correspondences, then we will still not be able to comprehend what we read, because it is not automatic enough. We are still spending too much working memory and cognitive resources still going through that translation process, rather than actually spending it focusing on what we are reading. The magic number here for all colleagues really is approximately 90 words correct per minute. You still have students who are reading something that's age-related, and I use air quotes for age-related because really there's no such thing as an age-related text. But if you have students who are reading under 90 correct words per minute, working on comprehension isn't going to help you at all. No amount of comprehension skill training is going to help you. They need to improve their fluency. And it's important because depending on where we put certain prosodic cues can really kind of can really change the comprehension of the sentences that we use. So if I'm stressing Robert, I'm stressing who borrowed the bike. If I'm stressing the word borrow, it's implying who, it was borrowed, it wasn't stolen. If I'm stressing the word my, I'm stressing there that Robert didn't borrow the bike. He didn't borrow Robert's, he borrowed mine. If I'm stressing the word new, then it's not the old one, it's the new one. If I'm stressing the word bicycle, then he didn't borrow a book or a car or anything like that. He borrowed my bike. So all of these things are crucial in understanding and getting to that point of comprehension. Now, it's important to note here that fluency, it's a continuum. There's no, 90 kind of words correct per minute is kind of like our bare minimum. However, even as adults, we are always improving our fluency, and that will depend on what texts that you read lots of. I'm not going to be very fluent in reading traditional Shakespeare, for example, compared to an English teacher who teaches Macbeth every year. And so that's a big part as well of making sure that when we are getting our students to read, we are doing lots and lots of reading with them. So thankfully, in the way to improve reading fluency has been researched very thoroughly, and bizarrely enough, it's actually not that difficult to improve someone's reading fluency. It's all about the reading mileage that they are doing. How much text is that person actually decoding? One of the best things that I can advise anyone at any point to do in their school is to follow someone around who they know has reading difficulties, particularly in, obviously in the decoding difficulties. Follow them around for a whole school day and time how much they actually spend eyes on text decoding a text. All the more fun if you take a little prediction beforehand, because I can guarantee you that it will probably be far less amount of time than you actually think. So how do we actually teach? How can we teach fluency so that it sticks? Well, quite simply, we can do things like paired reading. We can do repeated oral reading. So children are just reading text continuously, time and time and time again. So we might first of all model a paragraph or two. It needs to be modeled at such the length that students couldn't just memorize it. They need to actually go through that process of decoding all of those words. In terms of the kind of text that we should use, you're looking for about 90 out of 100 words students would get correct, so around 10 for every 100 words that they kind of really struggle with. You might then read it out loud to them, modeling it how the expert reader would read that particular text. It could be you, could even be a recording. Plenty of research out there that, you know, students, it was all from the 70s, so it was all done with old cassette tapes, but children listening to cassette tapes of adults, you know, reading something properly, very helpful. So things like Google Classroom and Audible these days, something that, you know, you could make work in the classroom. So once you've read it or children have heard it being read to them, they might give it a go. There'll be some feedback. The feedback is normally going to be, okay, well, how about if you try this particular sentence with this specific prosodic feature, so changing the word that you might stress, for example. You might have some goal setting in there, so you might want to say, well, let's see if you can knock maybe, you know, 5 seconds off that time to read it a bit quicker. It's always not necessarily great to aim for an arbitrary words correct per minute, because then you just get students who just try to read it so quickly that it's just sounds like a fumble and it's not coherent and doesn't make sense. But then at that point, once you kind of practice it, feedback, repeat, feedback, repeat, feedback, repeat, get those students reading a lot. And you might want to spend a bit of time then looking at comprehension, just asking a question or two, nothing too difficult, just to see, are these students understanding what they have read? And I'd like to think that if you have a student who starts off quite slowly, by the end of this repeated read, then you might get them further up. They might be more likely to answer a question correctly as their words correct per minute increases. Thankfully, over here, Hasbrook and Tyndall in 2017 did a little bit of research into these compiled oral reading fluency norms. It is American, so we have to take it with a pinch of salt. It's not going to work exactly as we want it to. It's not going to die. We can't just transpose it over, not least because of the way that the Americans see phonics, but it gives us a useful rough guide to kind of see what we might be aiming for each student and whether they're kind of on track in terms of their reading fluency. So again, it's American, so grade 1 is actually year 2, grade 6 is actually our year 7. So someone who's working at the bottom 10 percentile, they in winter term, so our autumn term, they have this case our spring term, but their summer term. They have words correct per minute of around 9. Someone in the top 10%, they have a words correct at the end of spring, of our spring term, of around 97. Someone in year 7 at the beginning of spring term, you know, they may just have words correct per minute of around 89. That's still under the magic 90 that we kind of looking for comprehension to happen. So any kind of year 7 colleagues, any one of the most useful things that you can do with those year 7s coming in is assess that reading fluency. To work out words correct per minute, it's quite simple. All you need to do is choose a bit of text that a student could read for around a minute or a minute and a half, have 2 copies. As they read it, you're going through yours. Any words that they read incorrectly, just strike off. Find out how many words are on that text completely. Divide the words that they got right by the amount of words in that text, times by 60, and then you have your words correct per minute. But it's still not enough. If we want to become an expert biker, we can read fluently, absolutely, but it helps if we know how to change gears. So we can look at comprehension. I kind of broken comprehension down into these particular structures. I think there are kind of 2 elements to this. If you want to become an expert biker, then learning how to change gear is really kind of useful. And so that's where I think background knowledge, vocabulary, strategies, and inferences does come into it. But if you know anything about British cycling, it was all then about those marginal 1% gains. And I kind of think language structures and literacy knowledge is kind of like having a really aerodynamic helmet, or having clip-on cycling gear. So we'll focus on the changing of the gears first. So when we actually comprehend, this is what I think we're kind of doing. It's this simultaneously extracting and constructing this meaning through interaction and involvement with written language. And so what happens in the mind of this reader is there's this construction integration model. Construction because the reader has to construct a model based on the words that the author has written. Integration because obviously an author does not write everything down. So a child will be bringing their own knowledge, background knowledge of this particular experience that they're reading about, and they integrate those things into a model, into what is, as if you're working with younger children, this idea of seeing the film in your head as you read. Now, I was working with some year 3s, I think a year or 2 ago. We were working on suspense stories. And so this was the opening kind of 2 sentences. It rained hard, the ogre stood at the top of the tall cliff. Now, so obviously for them to be able to comprehend this, to construct, they need to construct meaning from it rained hard. They may think, for example, that it rained hard what? That concept of it raining hard might be quite obscure to them. But lots of ones that they really struggle, because this was year 3, so this is 7 or 8-year-olds. So I wanted to make a suspense story, but their construction integration model was pretty much him. Now, as much as I love Shrek, he's not exactly the most terrifying of creatures to have as your kind of main character as a suspense story. What we're actually looking for is something like this, what I was looking for. And so this is where teaching this thing called comprehension monitoring, this strategy of comprehension monitoring, is quite important, because that tells you whether the construction integration model that students are kind of developing is going to be particularly accurate. So if you look at this particular example, it's quite easy to do. All you need to do is give students very simple sentences that are somewhat in opposite to each other. So here the sentence is, it rained hard, the ogre stood at the top of the tall cliffs that touched the blue sky. And so here the construction integration model is going to be quite a strange one. There's going to be that almost cognitive dissonance there, because obviously if it's raining hard, then these tall cliffs can't touch the blue sky, because for it to be raining, the skies has to be clouded over. And so giving students opportunities to pick out those inconsistencies that you might have just makes them aware that this comprehension monitoring, this construction integration model, this picture that they're building in their heads is something that they need to be consciously aware of. And yes, they will need to adapt it, and they'll need to check whether it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, that's the point then where we need to go back and reread it, try something, try a different strategy perhaps, which we'll get onto later on. Obviously, vocabulary is exceptionally important, and it could be a complete hour on its own here, but I'm sure most of us are familiar with this idea of Beck, McGowan, and McCullen's, I believe, tiered vocabulary. So this idea that we have this third tier of kind of subject-specific words, which are very kind of used just within that particular domain. We have these everyday words, which are our tiered one words, which you kind of pick up from everyday language and conversation that you use. And then in this middle, you have this high utility academic language. So it's, as it mentions, it's high utility, so it can be used across subjects. It's not tied or cemented down to one particular domain. And this is usually the kind of the language that students will trip up over and fall over when it comes to reading, because they do not know what these words mean. And so it offers us a good framework to teach these specific words. Plenty of resources out there. There are things like Avril Coxhead's academic word list. So here you can see just a portion of it. I think there are about 1,000 words altogether, but they're all kind of rated then in the words with the highest frequency are followed by the number 1. So you can kind of pick out which words have particularly high frequency, which words don't. And so you might adjust your teaching or choose to teach a range of these explicitly based on how frequent these words might appear along that. And obviously the idea is that we teach children what these words are, they'll see them in more text, they'll understand more because they can use these words to help construct that, integrate that, that mental model of the text that they're reading. There are other things that we can do. Obviously, it's impossible to teach students the entirety of every word. We can't teach them all words, every 70,000 words that they might have in their vocabulary. But there are things that we can do to kind of help push students along, and that's things like teaching morphology, so prefixes and suffixes. So if children can know that ish refers to somewhat like, or ness is a condition of state, or things like ology is the study of, then when they see things like morphology, or when they see things like geography or geology, it will help them just give that extra little strategy in their back pocket to help them understand what the text means. That more words that they read accurately, the greater that mental model that they can build up, the more likely it is to be accurate, the more likely their comprehension is to be accurate as well. Some other little things that we can do, obviously, we always have that conversation then, time is limited, so which prefixes are we going to do? Thankfully, a little bit of research a year or two ago came out. They took Avril Coxhead's academic word list, they did some fancy statistical analysis, and they kind of worked out then which are the most frequent prefixes within that academic word list. They have the full kind of collection, what it looks like in English language arts, so again what that might look like in English for us, what it looks like in maths, for example, in science and social studies, so history, geography, learning about the world, etc., etc. So something that might be quite useful for colleagues to look at and use when they want to think about, well, with the time that I have, which words am I actually going to teach? Fun ways that you can do that is with these particularly, they call them spelling matrices. So here you have this root word, what it means, and then you have all the possible prefixes and suffixes that can go with that. So, how many words can you make using this? Do you know what they all mean, etc., etc. But then something as well that I really enjoy is the kind of etymology, so understanding the history of where these words have come, because the Romans invaded Greece, and then because the Romans invaded France, and then because the Romans eventually got to Britain, we have a lot of Greek and we have a lot of Latin influences in our language. It's this whole other layer of code actually that we have after phonics, although it's quite common for people to say that English is a phonological language, which it is, but it's also a morphophonemic. So once you kind of understand the basic level of phonics, there's this whole kind of morphological layer over it, which comes from the Latin, comes from the Greek. So if we kind of teach children that micro is a Greek word that means small, then obviously when they come to microscope in science and microclimate in Geography, well, they understand that micro means small, so it's just giving them that extra boost that they might need to actually be able to understand what this word might mean. So things like they know that G is earth, geo can be earth, and ology can be study of, then obviously geology, they can understand it as being some sort of study of the earth. How can we do this? I think it's Alex Quigley in Closing the Vocabulary Gap mentions that Freya models, Freya diagrams are a particularly good way of teaching these. And I agree from the little bit of experimentation that I've done, kind of using it in the classroom. We have this, our root word might be hydro. So do our students know what hydro means? Because we are dealing with, or certainly I'm dealing with primary school age children. I don't mind them drawing a little bit if it helps them. Derived words, so what words can you think of that have hydro in it, that as that root of meaning kind of water, and then can you use one in a sentence? So it can be a nice little activity that you can use to start a day off, start a spelling lesson off, etc., etc. But again, you want to spend some time thinking, well, which root words do I think have the highest utility that are actually going to be useful? So you might look at if you know they're getting hydro in science or in geography, it may not be one that you then choose to teach in your particular subject or in a particular lesson if you're primary. And then we have this idea of vocabulary depth versus breadth. Breadth is very important, but not necessarily enough for comprehension. What we're looking for is to make sure that students actually understand and what those words are, funnily enough, and how deeply they understand those words can impact on comprehension. So if I asked you, how much you know about the word table, here are kind of your 6 potential layers of depth that you have. So you've heard of it or seen the word before, you know something about the meaning, you might be able to give a simple example of how the word is used. You might be able to produce the examples of the word, you can explain the meaning or a different meaning, provide a synonym or an antonym, or you might be able to give then a theoretical definition of the word. The reason 4 is highlighted is because some research seems to suggest that anything shallower than 4, that's where the comprehension kind of really struggles. If they can do 4, 5, or 6, then students really are beginning to understand that word, so they are very likely to be able to comprehend it quite simply, quite easily. And so when you're thinking about your tier 2 language, it's not just about throwing lots and lots at them, although that's, there is an element of that, but it's getting that balance between the depth of that vocabulary, but also that breadth they're giving. And I think Freya diagrams offer a good way to get to kind of that 4th layer so that they can really understand what they're reading. Then we come to my the most kind of contested part, I think, which is this idea of comprehension strategies and skills. For a long time, there's lots of talk about comprehension skills, particularly I'm talking about primary here, quite a common practice, certainly, and I'm guilty of it, so I'm not blaming anyone, but certainly when I was in year 6, we would do a SATs paper, maybe around, just before October half term. I'd mark it, I would do some sort of question level analysis, and funnily enough, lots of children would not do particularly well at inferencing. And so what we would do is we'd set up an intervention, usually in the afternoon when things like history, science, and geography, art, DT were happening. And children would go out with a TA for maybe 20, 30 minutes and do just lots of inference practice in the hope that that would then somehow kind of translate to better inferences. It's a waste of time, quite honestly. There is no research to suggest that comprehension is a skills-based endeavor, that there are these things like inference or retrieval and explanation or sequencing and summarizing and predicting, that these are things that you can teach in isolation and expect them to have an impact on unseen texts. It's not the case at all. And the best way for you to get some time back with those students who do need more support with inferencing, because obviously inferences are important, is to actually make sure that they are kept in those science, geography, history, art, DT lessons, so they can use that background knowledge they hopefully get from those lessons to help them make those inferences, because quite a big correlation between background knowledge, how quick you can retrieve that background knowledge, and the inferences that you can then make. So what you tend to kind of see, what I've kind of seen, I just kind of searched here for a reading timetable for a primary school: vocabulary, inference, retrieval and explanation, prediction. These have just been taken from the reading domains. And so as those are what we children are assessed to go on, well, it kind of makes sense to map those out across the whole week, but it's not the way that it works. Likewise with this one, I might get my children to read all of this particular text, and then I'll get them to answer questions. But if you think back to what we taught about that integration model, this is where this idea kind of falls down. If the integration model that those students are building in their head, if that falls down in the first paragraph, but we're making students read all of this anyway, and then answering the questions, then that model that they built up in their head has been wrong since the first paragraph, since sentence 2. So of course, by the time they've read the whole of that text, they're not going to be able to answer these questions because that model is completely wrong. So what we need to get students to do is, or what teachers need to get in the habit of doing, is read a little bit and then get children to answer those questions, to make sure that that integration model is building up correctly at the time that they are meant to be building it up. And that's where you can do things like metacognitive talk and all of that kind of thing. So I do applaud you if you are still talking about comprehension skills, if you're doing things like inference on a Wednesday and summarizing Tuesdays, for example, whatever it might be, there is a better way to spend your time. That's not to say that there aren't a few things that we can do to help our students with this comprehension, but it's things to do with strategies. Now, strategies and skills, these two words do get used quite, they're used interchangeably for whatever reason, but they mean, certainly in the reading literature, they mean something else. There is zero evidence for comprehension skills. However, there is plenty of evidence for comprehension strategies. So what strategies should we actually be using in the classroom? Well, we've talked about one already, this idea of kind of comprehension monitoring. Getting students to summarize is a particularly effective strategy to make sure that what they have read is accurate. Getting students to self-question as they read. So that's this idea of, well, does this make sense? Does that fit in with what I've read before? Am I getting that? Is this model that I'm building up, is it actually useful? Does it actually make sense at this point now after this sentence? Because it's then when they can use that and they kind of reflect on that, and then they say, well, no, something doesn't quite make sense. That's when they then decide to hopefully go back and read through it again, make that correction and move on, hopefully correctly. Things like visualization, quite a few students actually don't understand that this idea of visualizing something is something that you can do actually with reading. So this idea that actually, do you know what, I just need you to visualize what you're reading, make that picture, read a little bit, close your eyes if you have to, draw it down. That can certainly help a little bit at that beginning stage of moving away from fluency to a bit of to comprehension. And then of course, activating prior knowledge, all of those things are important as well. How we can teach them is through this gradual release of responsibility. So it's something that the teacher would model first, model it a lot to begin with, and then gradually and eventually the students start doing it more and more. It needs to be intentional. So these aren't going to be things that we can just kind of teach and then students will just do it kind of by themselves or not do it by themselves. We have to tell students, okay, well, maybe now using your summarization might help you, or go back to the last paragraph and summarize what you've done before. would be quite useful. They don't need to be the main focus of every lesson. For lots of reading, it's always been about the particular skill that you're trying to teach has been the focus of the main lesson. It shouldn't be. The focus of the reading lesson is to either read a lot of text or to learn something from the text that you are currently reading. Now, there's no kind of research that's conclusive as to how long is needed for these, but it seems to be about maybe 2 to kind of 6 weeks. And once you kind of taught students that, you've been explicit with it enough for around that amount of time, that's the point when students start using these by themselves. It doesn't need to be something that is taught every day for every year from year 3 all the way up to year 6 across the whole week. It's not something that needs to be done. Teach it explicitly at the beginning of the year and just refer to it as you're doing whole class guided reading, and that will be enough. So yes, please drop skills, start using strategies. And the same then obviously applies to inference. It is not a generic skill. No amount of inference training will make you a better inference. That said, though, there are a few things about inference that is useful, or certainly are useful for teachers to know. That's this idea of a local cohesive inference. And this clarifies the meaning of words and phrases by linking them to other words and phrases in the text. So, for example, I have the turtle sat on a log, the fish swam under it. Well, what is it referring to? Is it referring to the turtle? Is it referring to the log? Does it actually make a difference which one it is or not, etc.? So these kind of pronouns that we use are something that really can trick up children quite a lot when they learn to read first. Then you have a kind of a global inference. This connects different parts of the text by linking them to your overall mental models. That's kind of you then bringing in your background knowledge or background information as well. So, for example, the children looked around the exhibition. When the alarm went off, they quickly found their teacher who led them to safety. Well, if I asked you where this particular place was, you could use your background knowledge and the text in front of you to kind of work out that they were probably in a museum. We don't know which museum that is, though, but that's where the elaborative inference comes in. And the elaborative inference it's not that important, and actually it can be when students bring too much background knowledge into the equation. So they might say here, an elaborative inference would be, well, they were in this particular museum, the science, the natural history, the V&A museum, because they were just there over the weekend, or they were there last week on a school trip, for example. There's not really enough information there for us to work out that's where they were. So this is where the inference goes too far. And I think these kind of 3 inferences are particularly useful because it helps us then with our questions. If we're coming across these particular anaphorial phrases, like where there's lots of pronouns, asking those questions, who does he, she, it refer to in that, at that point, is going to make sure that integration model is correct for all of our students. Then there are things like these kind of cohesive ties, which includes our common anaphors like the pronouns he, it, she, or they, or certain verb phrases, for example. And then you have kind of lexical cohesion, which is an anaphoric link which is created between 2 definite nouns, for example. So understanding here that the bottle refers back to this orange juice that was here, that was over here or up here, this kind of whole and part model where the part of the picnic was the picnic supply, so they need to understand that the cider came from there. That can be quite important. And again, these are kind of our micro gains at this point, I think. An item and a broader category, so 2 large lagers in this case, but when we see the word the drinks, they are referring back to those 2 large lagers. And then things like synonyms. So here, that pullover at the end actually refers back to the pile jumpers that Glenn had. All of these are kind of things that can help improve comprehension within that language structure element. And again, useful here to make a note of these when they come up and address them at the point where they come up. All you have to do is do it a couple of times and eventually students will again hopefully start making those connections. But if there are some particular rare instances, then obviously stop everyone and teach it explicitly. Connectives, now this might seem one that you kind of don't need to worry about, but certainly understanding the connective from an idea of writing and the idea of reading it has been, I think, for me, since I've kind of read around the subject, something that's been quite interesting is just actually how much the comprehension of a piece of text can alter depending on the connectives that they've used. And that's kind of then illustrated in that example there. June left the barbecue early kind of just before Bill arrived. June left the barbecue early after Bill arrived. June left the barbecue early at the very moment Bill arrived. So all of these kind of connectives, they can impact then on how that model is then built up. And that model, these kind of small words that we think are maybe not so sufficient, can actually then have a big impact, later on, depending on what happens in our story. So being very clear and precise and thinking about teaching children, really explicitly what these connectives actually are doing and what they mean at that point when they were read in the story is particularly useful. Then this kind of wider idea of literacy knowledge. So there are kind of two very broad text genres, kind of narrative versus informational expository text. If you haven't read Christopher Booker's The 7 Basics to Plot, it's really good. Christopher Booker basically takes down every kind of story that's ever been told and brings it down into several plots, like overcoming the monster, comedy, rebirth, rags to riches, a tragedy, quest, and like voyage and return, etc. And so someone who is, or a reader who has read and understands those plots, if they're coming to a new story that has a similar plot of, overcoming the monster, for example. So I'm just thinking, if they've read Eric the Viking in year 4, and then they move on to, Homer's Odyssey or Odysseus when they go to year 7, year 8, they can make that link between understanding, oh yeah, so I can draw in the knowledge of that particular text structure, and I can see and I can use that to help me comprehend what might happen later on. When we're thinking about expository text, there are certain different types. You have normally description, sequence, compare and contrast, cause and effects, and problem solution. And then you have your different signaling words up here, which could illustrate which different type they're going to be. Obviously, then the more that we're aware and we're telling students the type of expository or informational text that they are reading, the more then they can kind of integrate all of that into their schema. It's going to help them with their comprehension as well. Graphic organizers are another particular way that's been shown in the research to help improve comprehension. Again, and I think it's just a way to kind of help embed what I've already briefly discussed. This call comes from the National Reading Panel, which was a big panel in America, 21 years ago now. But this idea of actually being able to link particular text types and there being a particular graphic organizer that is particularly useful to demonstrate that those relationships can be very helpful. So here, for example, are some graphic organizers. Here are some text types for the expository or the information text. If we had more time, then I'd ask you to kind of match it all up. But to help with the comprehension, if you know that you're looking at particular text, so sequencing, for example, then getting children to build a graphic organizer that is just 1, 2, 3, 4 might be useful. Getting something to do a cause and effect using something like this will be useful. Getting something to do with some sort of comparing and contrasting and putting it in a graphic organizer like this will be useful. Description, putting it in something like this will be useful. But again, minimum for the time I think you'd spend to do this, if they haven't got their decoding, if the background knowledge isn't there, that's the things that you need to spend your time on. And then to kind of just wrap it all up, we can then kind of look at this idea of disciplinary literacy. It's quite different to the idea of when, literacy all across the curriculum, but it is kind of really looking at how you can use how the expert scientist, historian, mathematician, how the expert, professor of literature looks at how they then approach reading as well. So again, to sum it all up, it's how reading and writing like the experts in a given field do. Lots of what comes next comes from this particular resource here. It is free, so if you just Google the SAT suits and classroom practice, English and Language Arts Literacy, you will find it. Particularly useful, I think, for secondary colleagues, primary school. You might touch a little of it in year 6, but certainly I personally think it's making sure that those students leave fluently, and making sure that we're building up a good range of comprehension strategies that they can use, and making sure that they can, we're giving them as much background knowledge as possible, really, but still something useful for teachers to look at. And so I think, to carry on my metaphor, this is then, right, okay, you're pretty good at riding a bike now. Now do you want to try a bit of mountain biking, a bit of BMXing, or maybe try the Tour de France or something like that? So I've got 3 examples here. We have the text and kind of what the reading looks like. So a scientific text might kind of look like something like this, where the scientists write their observations, descriptions of experiments, etc., the proposals, what they do, whatever it may be. Obviously, there might be a bit of some explanations there for lay people like myself who don't understand science all too well. In history, it might be looking at various interpretive lenses, the interpretations of the past, and literature, all about the human existence and the imagery, symbolization, metaphor, etc., etc. But when they kind of read, when a scientist comes to that text, obviously they're bringing a lot of knowledge of that content. They're bringing in not just that particular content itself, but the scientific method, the research in the field, research methodology. Scientists, they're pretty good. They're used to working with models, so they're pretty good at evaluating multimodal information. And interestingly enough, scientists tend not to read linearly. An expert in the field will kind of go back and forth between perhaps a model and its explanation, while at the same time still making sense of what they're reading. Historians, they read in a way that's consistent with how knowledge is created and communicated in their disciplines. So making sure that obviously they'll be checking those sources. They'll then be reading to check that it's contextualized for the specific period that they're studying in. And obviously then they'll be checking then, is it any claims that have been made in that particular text, have they been corroborated by other academic historians with some element of validity. The expert, one in literature, draws on their knowledge of how the field creates, communicates, and evaluates that literature. They know how meaning is put into literacy texts, so they know how to approach those texts to get meaning out of them. So if you want to teach children or students, year 7, 8, 9s, to kind of be critical of the literature that they are reading, which is obviously something that we always want, it's understanding of, they need to have that understanding of how you first put meaning in, so they can then extract that coming out. So what can you do, teachers, secondary teachers, to kind of help teach disciplinary literacy? Again, it's far from my area of expertise, being primary, but from the research, kind of this is what it says that we can do, which is obviously make these texts available. So this academic reading, that does seem to be having a bit of a comeback. Giving students the opportunity to read those texts, so useful to reading and giving students the time to read it, maybe as a homework task, and then discussing afterwards. Linking the reading that you're doing and the writing you're doing to inquiry work. I don't obviously mean that by doing inquiries in what we were all doing in the early 2000s, but through historical or geographical or scientific inquiry. Provide that explicit instruction into those discipline-specific text features and formats, which I dare not question how you do that, because that is definitely your domain, and you'd be far more proficient at doing that than I ever will be. but providing those explicit instructions and discipline-based strategies and approaches. So, really teaching that discipline. So that's that disciplinary knowledge that we want to make sure that our students are getting. They understand how the subject of science, how the subject of history, how the subject of literature works. Teaching the nature of argument and evidence, and obviously developing rich content knowledge of the discipline. So I interpret that as creating really strong, exciting, knowledge-rich curricula. Hopefully that gives you a flavor of reading from novice to hopefully expert, and some things that you can be doing, and hopefully gives you a bit of an understanding of what the expert reader goes through to get to the point where they're actually there. Some really great further reading here is Mark Steinberg, Language at the Speed of Sight, which is fantastic one at looking at how language first came about and how reading and writing first came about, but also computational models and statistical learning and statistical properties, which I didn't have time to go in today. This particular, it's free, this one, and it has that chapter on disciplinary literacy, but also on vocabulary. Understanding and teaching reader comprehension has all of the ideas of those kind of small marginal gain ideas of what an inference is, with this idea of semantics and anaphor, etc., etc. There's a wonderful chapter in the Research Ed Guide to Leadership by the Reading Ape on leading reading at the primary level, but useful, I think, if you are working a secondary school where you have students who come up who aren't at the reading level that they should be, of what can be done there. And everyone's favorite cognitive scientist, Daniel T. Willingham, on the reading mind is a really good use. It's a great diving board then for how the mind learns to read. If you asked me to recommend, I think if you're interested in the spelling aspect, and I'm hoping I will do some stuff on spelling in the new year, but this is also a free PDF, the English spelling lexicon from Sounds Right, and it details what those 176 common spellings are and how you might then use that to help children improve spelling. But if I was to offer just kind of one book, it would definitely be The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading. Secondary school colleagues, don't be put off by the word primary. Again, if you have students in there who aren't reading fluently, then everything that Christopher discusses and talks about in this book will be extremely relevant to what you are doing. He does a great job of synthesizing everything I've talked about and more, but also offering a far more kind of practical how this might work in the classroom. You can find him on Twitter at Suchmo83. So if you're still with me and you managed about that 1.5 hours, thank you very much. I hope it was a useful 1.5 hours of your time at your half term. And if you're coming to see me in an hour's time to talk about curriculum, I look forward to it. If not, have a wonderful, lovely rest of the day. And I look forward to seeing your reactions and everything on Twitter. Thank you very much.